Hello my dear viewers, I would like to thank you for watching the video and I wanted to say subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be very grateful and you will not miss new videos. Enjoy the video. My name is Darren Hart and I've been a private investigator for 8 years. Over the years, I've dealt with everything from missing pets to cheating spouses, but nothing prepared me for the case I took last October. It all started when I got a call from Mrs. Louise Harper, the manager of a rundown apartment complex on the edge of downtown Chicago. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and I could tell right away she wasn't used to asking for help. "Mr. Hart," she said, "one of my tenants has gone missing. His name is Vincent Monroe, and I'm worried something's happened to him." Missing persons weren't my usual line of work, but I was between cases, and something about the way she sounded piqued my interest. I agreed to meet her the next morning. The apartment complex was worse than I expected: peeling paint, flickering hallway lights, and a smell like damp carpet. Mrs. Harper was waiting for me in the lobby, clutching a folder of papers to her chest like a shield. "Vincent's been living here for 2 years, she explained as we rode the creaky elevator up to the 7th floor. "Always paid his rent on time, kept to himself. But no one's seen him in almost a week, and his rent's overdue. That's not like him." "Have you contacted the police?" I asked. She shook her head quickly. "I don't want trouble for the building. We've had incidents here before." That last part caught my attention. I made a mental note to ask her about it later. When we reached Vincent's apartment, Mrs. Harper handed me the key with a nervous glance. "I already tried knocking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I opened the door and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and something faintly metallic. The apartment was neat, almost unnervingly so: no dishes in the sink, no clutter on the counters. But it didn't feel right. I found my first clue in the living room. A coffee table had been pushed to one side, and the rug underneath it was bunched up, as if someone had been in a hurry. A single shoe lay discarded near the couch, its laces undone. "Vincent," I called, even though I knew no one would answer. Then I noticed something strange. The walls, they were bare, except for one. A large mirror hung directly across from the couch. It was the only decoration in the entire apartment, and something about it made my skin crawl. When I looked closer, I saw fingerprints smudged across the glass. And in the middle of the mirror, etched faintly into the surface, were 4 words: "Do not look back." I stood frozen in front of the mirror, staring at the faint words, "Do not look back." The way the letters were etched, like they'd been scratched into the glass with something sharp, sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just the message, it was the fingerprints all around it, smeared and chaotic, as if someone had been clawing at the mirror. I reached out, running my fingers over the surface. The scratches felt fresh, the edges rough against my skin. "Is something wrong?" Mrs. Harper's voice startled me, and I turned quickly. "Have you been in here since he disappeared?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She shook her head, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. "No, I told you this is the first time I've been inside. I didn't want to intrude." I glanced around the room again, noticing little details I hadn't before. A half-empty glass of water on the kitchen counter, a jacket draped neatly over a chair, a stack of unopened mail by the door. It was as if Vincent had just stepped out for a moment and never come back. But the message in the mirror suggested something darker. "Did Vincent ever mention anything unusual?" I asked. "Strange visitors, odd behavior, Anything like that? Mrs. Harper hesitated, her eyes darting toward the mirror before quickly looking away. He kept to himself, she said carefully, but there was one thing. I waited, sensing she wasn't telling me everything. About a month ago, he came down to the lobby, looking pale as a ghost, she said finally. He asked if there had been any reports of noises. She nodded. He said he kept hearing someone whispering his name at night. But when he'd get up to check, no one was there. My stomach tightened, and you didn't think to follow up on that. She bristled. I'm not a detective, Mr. Hart. He said it was probably just the wind or the pipes. I glanced back at the mirror, unease growing in my chest. Did he ever say where he heard the whispers coming from? The hallway, she said quietly, right outside his door. Before I could respond, a faint creak echoed from behind me. I spun around, my pulse quickening. The apartment was empty. Did you hear that? I whispered. Mrs. Harper nodded, her face pale. It came from the hallway. I stepped out of the apartment, peering into the dimly lit corridor. The air felt colder out here, heavier. As I moved further down the hall, something caught my eye, a faint smear of red on the wall, just a few feet from Vincent's door. I crouched to get a better look. It was dried blood, streaked in a straight line as if someone had dragged their hand along the wall. The trail led to the end of the hallway, stopping abruptly in front of an old wooden door. That's the maintenance closet, Mrs. Harper whispered, clutching her sweater tightly. But no one's used it in years. My hand moved to the doorknob. It was ice cold, and the second I touched it, I felt a prickling sensation crawl up my arm. Wait, Mrs. Harper said, her voice trembling. Maybe we should call the police. I turned to her, but before I could answer, a loud thud came from behind the door. The loud thud echoed through the hallway, sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. I hesitated, my hand still on the doorknob of the maintenance closet. Behind me, Mrs. Harper took a step back, her face as pale as the flickering fluorescent lights above us. Don't open it, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I wasn't about to leave without knowing what was inside. If Vincent was in there, or if there was any clue about what happened to him, I had to find out. I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The hinges creaked loudly, revealing a small, cramped room filled with dusty shelves, old tools, and cleaning supplies. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of mildew and rust. At first glance, there was nothing unusual, but then I saw the floor. A large, dark stain spread across the cracked linoleum, and even in the dim light, I could tell what it was: blood. Jesus, I muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. The blood had dried, but it wasn't ancient. Maybe a few days old, at most. Mrs. Harper stood frozen in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. This can't be real. I've never seen anything like this before. I pulled out my phone, using the flashlight to scan the room. That's when I noticed something else, a faint scuff mark on the floor, leading to the far corner where an old shelving unit leaned against the wall. The scuff mark looked like it had been made recently, as if something heavy had been dragged. Help me move this, I said, motioning to the shelf. Mrs. Harper hesitated, but the look in my eyes must have convinced her. Together we pushed the shelf aside, the sound of metal scraping against the floor echoing through the tiny room. Behind it was a small, square opening in the wall, a crawl space. The opening was barely big enough for a person to fit through, but the edges were smeared with more blood. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't just a random hiding spot. Someone had been dragged through here. What? What is that, Mrs. Harper stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. Instead, I crouched down, shining my flashlight into the crawl space. It was dark and narrow, the walls lined with cobwebs and grime. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into shadows. Then, just as I was about to look away, I saw it. A single, muddy handprint on the inside wall of the crawl space. The handprint was fresh. Vincent, I called, my voice echoing faintly. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, from deep within the crawl space, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a whisper, faint, raspy, and impossible to make out. But I recognized one thing. It was saying my name. The whispering sound sent a shiver down my spine. Darren. It was faint but unmistakable, echoing from deep within the crawl space. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I stared into the dark tunnel. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Mrs. Harper shook her head furiously, her back pressed against the wall as if she was trying to get as far away as possible. "No, and I don't want to. Whatever this is, it's not right." She was right about one thing: this wasn't right, but I couldn't walk away now. "I have to check it out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're out of your mind," Mrs. Harper hissed. What if it's him?" I didn't answer. Instead, I knelt down and crawled into the narrow opening, the cold, damp air wrapping around me like a shroud. My flashlight illuminated the space ahead, but the shadows seemed to press in closer with every inch I moved forward. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just my name anymore. It was fragments of sentences, disjointed and eerie. "Help me, please. It's coming." I stopped crawling, my heart hammering in my chest. "Vincent, is that you?" The whisper stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. And then, somewhere ahead of me, something moved. It was subtle, just the faintest shuffling sound, like fabric brushing against the walls. My flashlight beam darted around, but all I could see were cobwebs and dirt. "Darren, come back." Mrs. Harper's voice called from behind me, but it sounded so far away now. I forced myself to keep going, the whispers echoing in my ears as I crawled deeper into the tunnel. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw something ahead. The tunnel opened up into a small chamber. My flashlight revealed a tangle of old wires and broken pipes hanging from the ceiling, but that wasn't what caught my attention. In the center of the chamber was a figure, hunched and unmoving. "Vincent," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It looked human, at least I thought it did. But as I stepped closer, the flashlight beam revealed something that made my stomach turn. The figure's skin was pale and stretched taut, its face frozen in a grotesque expression of terror. Its hands were clawed, with dried blood caked under the nails. And its eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as the whispers suddenly returned, louder and more urgent. "Don't look back. Don't look back." The figure's mouth moved, its jaw creaking open unnaturally wide, and a guttural, inhuman voice spilled out, "You shouldn't have come." The figure's voice echoed through the chamber, low and guttural, vibrating in my chest. "You shouldn't have come." I stumbled backward, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. "Vincent," I whispered again, though deep down I knew the thing in front of me wasn't him. The figure didn't move. Its unblinking eyes were locked on mine, but something about the way it sat there, hunched and frozen, made it seem wrong, like it was waiting for something. Behind me, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from the figure, it was coming from the tunnel I had just crawled through. "Darren, don't look back." The voice was raspy and faint, but now it was joined by others, overlapping and chaotic. "Get out? It's coming. Don't turn around." I felt cold air brush the back of my neck, and my stomach churned. I didn't want to turn around, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I twisted my head to look over my shoulder. The flashlight beam flickered as it swept over the tunnel behind me. At first, I saw nothing but darkness, but then, just at the edge of the light, something moved. It was a shadow, tall and unnaturally thin, slithering across the walls and ceiling. It moved like smoke, twisting and curling as it came closer. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to look back at the figure in the chamber. It was gone. The spot where it had been sitting was empty, but I hadn't heard it move. Panic set in. I scrambled to crawl back through the tunnel, my hands and knees scraping against the rough walls. The whispers followed me, louder and more frantic, urging me to move faster. "Don't let it touch you. Don't let it touch you." The cold air behind me grew stronger, and I could feel the presence of the shadow creeping closer. It wasn't just in the tunnel, it was in the walls, the floor, the very air around me. By the time I reached the opening, I was gasping for breath. I pulled myself out of the crawl space and slammed my back against the wall, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. Mrs. Harper was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong? What happened? Get out of here," I panted, struggling to catch my breath. "We need to leave now." She hesitated, glancing at the crawl space behind me. "Did you find him? Did you find Vincent?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "But something's down there, and it's not human." Before she could respond, a loud, bone-chilling scream erupted from the crawl space. It was inhuman, guttural, and filled with rage. Mrs. Harper screamed, backing away from the door. "What is that?" I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the hallway. "We're not staying to find out," but as we ran, the lights in the hallway flickered violently. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, moving faster than they should. And then, just as we reached the elevator, the doors slammed shut on their own. The shadow was here. The elevator doors shut with a deafening clang, plunging the hallway into silence. Mrs. Harper clung to my arm, her face pale and streaked with sweat. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't need her to tell me. The air had turned icy, and the shadows along the walls were alive, twisting and curling like they had a mind of their own. "We have to get to the stairs," I said, keeping my voice low. "Mrs. Harper nodded, but her steps were unsteady as we moved toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. Each step felt like it took an eternity, and the flickering lights made it hard to tell where the shadows ended and the darkness began. Halfway there, a sound stopped us in our tracks, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I shone my flashlight down the hall, and that's when I saw it, the shadow. It was no longer slithering along the walls, it had taken form, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall and thin, with impossibly long limbs and a face that seemed to shift and blur, like smoke caught in the wind. Its eyes, or what I thought were its eyes, glowed faintly to pinpoints of pale light that pierced through the darkness, and it was moving toward us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Mrs. Harper's arm and pulling her with me. We bolted down the hall, the sound of our footsteps echoing against the walls. The growl grew louder, turning into a roar that vibrated in my chest. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the shadow closing in, its cold presence crawling up my spine. When we reached the stairwell door, I yanked it open and shoved Mrs. Harper inside. She stumbled onto the landing, and I followed, slamming the door shut behind us. For a moment there was silence. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. Mrs. Harper was crouched on the floor, shaking. "Did we lose it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. My hand was still on the door, and I could feel the cold seeping through the metal, like the shadow was just on the other side. Then the lights in the stairwell flickered. "No," I whispered. "It's not gone." A low growl echoed from below, and I realized with horror that the shadow wasn't just behind the door, it was in the stairwell too. "We have to keep moving," I said, pulling Mrs. Harper to her feet. We started down the stairs, moving as quickly as we could. The growl followed us, growing louder with each step. By the time we reached the second floor, the lights went out completely. "Darren!" Mrs. Harper cried, her voice filled with panic. "I'm here," I said, grabbing her hand. My flashlight was the only source of light now, its beam cutting through the suffocating darkness. But the shadows were everywhere, creeping up the walls and swirling around us. They were alive, reaching out with claw-like tendrils that seemed to dissolve into smoke the moment they touched the light. Then, ahead of us, I saw it, the door to the lobby. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of pale light spilling through. "There!" I shouted, pulling Mrs. Harper toward it. We ran, the shadows closing in around us. The growl turned into a deafening roar, and I felt something cold brush against my arm, like icy fingers clawing at me. We burst through the door and into the lobby, the sudden brightness blinding us. I turned and slammed the door shut, pressing my weight against it as if that could keep the shadow out. For a moment, everything was still. Then, from behind the door, I heard the whispers again. "Don't look back. Don't look back." I stood against the stairwell door, my chest heaving, the whispers echoing in my ears. "Don't look back. Don't look back." Mrs. Harper collapsed onto a nearby chair, trembling and clutching her sweater like it was the only thing holding her together. What was that thing?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I admitted, my own voice shaky. "But it's not over." The whispers grew fainter, fading into the silence. Slowly, I stepped away from the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it didn't. The lobby was still, the faint hum of the flickering fluorescent lights the only sound. I turned to Mrs. Harper. "We need to call the police. Whatever this is, it's beyond us." She nodded weakly, and I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed. But before I could press call, something caught my eye. The large mirror on the lobby wall. At first glance, it looked normal. But as I stepped closer, I saw them fingerprints smeared across the glass, just like the mirror in Vincent's apartment. And in the center of the mirror, etched faintly into the surface, were the same four words, "Do not look back." My blood turned to ice, the door behind me creaked, and a cold draft swept through the lobby. Mrs. Harper screamed. I spun around, my flashlight snapping to the stairwell door, which had inched open just enough to reveal the darkness beyond. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent now, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. Don't look. It's watching. Don't let it see you. And then I heard it, the low, guttural growl that I would never forget. I grabbed Mrs. Harper's arm and pulled her toward the exit. We're leaving now. The front doors of the building were just a few steps away, but every step felt like a mile. The growl grew louder, and the air around us grew colder with every passing second. We reached the doors, and I threw them open, dragging Mrs. Harper outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop until we were in the middle of the parking lot, far away from the building. Hello my dear viewers, I would like to thank you for watching the video, and I wanted to say subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be very grateful and you will not miss new videos. Enjoy the video. My name is Josh Miller, and I've always thought of myself as a regular guy. I live in Chicago, I work in IT, and my life is about as exciting as a tax seminar. Or at least it was until the day I found that apartment. It started on a Thursday. I just moved into a new place, a decent little studio on the edge of downtown. Nothing fancy, but it had a good view of the city, and for someone like me, that was enough. I was unpacking when I noticed something strange. The floor plan didn't match. Let me explain. When I first toured the place, the agent gave me a blueprint of the apartment. It was supposed to be straightforward, a single open room with a kitchenette and a tiny bathroom off to the side. But when I stood in the living room, something felt wrong. The wall across from me seemed closer than it should have been, like there was something behind it. I pulled out the blueprint and double-checked. Sure enough, there was supposed to be an extra 3 feet of space behind that wall. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just poor construction, but curiosity got the better of me, and I started knocking on the wall, looking for anything unusual. That's when I heard a hollow sound. I froze, my hand still pressed against the drywall. Hollow walls meant space, right? But there wasn't supposed to be anything back there. Grabbing a flashlight from one of the moving boxes, I crouched down and inspected the baseboard. That's when I noticed something odd. There was a tiny seam in the wall, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I pressed my fingers against it, and to my surprise, the panel popped open. Behind it was a narrow passage. It wasn't much, just a dark, cramped corridor that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The air smelled stale, like dust and mildew. I should have closed the panel and gone back to unpacking. But something about the passage called to me, like it was daring me to explore. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, and started walking. The corridor was tight, the walls pressing in on either side. After a few feet, it opened into a small, windowless room. The first thing I noticed was the furniture. It was old, really old. A battered armchair sat in one corner, its fabric torn and stained. There was a wooden table with deep scratches across the surface and a rusted lamp that didn't look like it had worked in years. But what really caught my attention was the wall. It was covered in photographs, dozens of them, pinned up haphazardly. Some were black and white, others faded with age. They all showed the same thing: people. Random people walking through the city, sitting in cafes, standing at bus stops. And in every photo, their faces were crossed out with thick, red ink. My stomach churned as I scanned the wall, my flashlight trembling. These weren't just snapshots, they felt deliberate, like someone had been watching these people. In the center of the wall was a larger photo, framed and hung like a centerpiece. It was of a man, mid-30s, clean-shaven, wearing a suit and tie. His face wasn't crossed out like the others, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked at the camera, like he knew whoever was taking the picture. Beneath the frame was a single word scrawled in red ink, WHY. That was enough for me. I turned and bolted back through the passage, slamming the panel shut behind me. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. But as I stood there, trying to calm down, I heard it. A soft creak. It came from inside the passage. Someone or something was moving in there. I froze, my ear pressed against the wall, straining to hear. The creaking sound wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, slow, measured, like someone taking careful steps. I wanted to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the building was old, the pipes shifting, or the walls settling. But deep down, I knew better. Someone or something was in that passage. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord. It went straight to voicemail. Figures. "Hi, this is Josh Miller in 3C, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I think there's something weird going on with the apartment. Can you call me back when you get this?" I hung up and stood there for a moment, debating what to do. I didn't hear the creaking anymore, but that didn't mean whoever or whatever it was had left. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed in the living room, pacing back and forth, staring at the spot where the panel was hidden. I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was time to leave. Whatever this was, I didn't want any part of it. I started packing my things when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. You shouldn't have opened it. I stared at the screen, my stomach churning. How did they have my number? My hand shook as I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. Instead, I heard a knock at the door. I approached cautiously, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But when I peeked through the peephole, I saw a man standing in the hallway. He was wearing a suit and tie, his face clean-shaven, his posture rigid. It was the man from the photograph. My breath caught in my throat. He didn't move, didn't knock again. He just stood there, staring straight ahead like he knew I was watching. I stepped back, my heart pounding. This wasn't possible. The photograph looked like it was decades old. How could he be standing here now? The knocking came again, louder this time. I backed away, clutching my phone, debating whether to call the police. But before I could dial, the knocking stopped. When I looked through the peephole again, he was gone. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air in the apartment felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. I kept hearing faint sounds, creaks, whispers, the occasional soft thud, but every time I checked, there was nothing there. Then I heard the panel. It was a soft click, like someone opening it. My blood ran cold as I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the wall. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Nothing. Slowly, I pushed the panel open, shining the flashlight inside. The passage was empty, just as dark and narrow as before. But when I stepped inside, I noticed something new. Another photograph. It was pinned to the far wall where the furniture and other photos had been. This one was of me, taken from the passage. I was sitting on my couch, staring at the wall. The time stamp in the corner was from last night. Pinned beneath the photo was a note, "You're next." I don't think I've ever been as terrified as I was in that moment. Seeing myself in the photograph, proof that someone had been in my apartment watching me, made my stomach churn. I stumbled out of the passage, slamming the panel shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the flashlight. I grabbed my phone and called 911. The operator's voice was calm, almost detached. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in my apartment, I stammered. They've been inside. They've been watching me. Are they in the apartment now? I hesitated, glancing toward the panel. I don't know. The operator asked for my address and told me to stay on the line, but I couldn't. I hung up and grabbed my keys, ready to leave. But when I opened the door to the hallway, I froze. The man in the suit was standing there again. His expression was blank, almost bored, but his eyes locked onto mine as soon as the door opened. "You can't leave," he said. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was stating the weather. I didn't respond. I just slammed the door and locked it, my heart racing. I grabbed my backpack and stuffed it with whatever I could find: wallet, phone charger, a bottle of water. I didn't care about anything else. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. I ran to the window, my mind racing. I was on the 3rd floor, but maybe I could climb down somehow. Before I could decide, I heard it again, the creaking. This time, it wasn't coming from the panel. It was coming from inside the apartment. I turned slowly, my flashlight scanning the room. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, like they were alive. "Josh," a voice whispered. I whipped around, the beam of light catching the edge of the couch. No one was there. "Josh," the voice said again, closer this time. It wasn't the man in the suit. It was me. The voice was mine, but it was distorted, wrong, like hearing a recording played underwater. I backed toward the door, my breath coming in short gasps. The panel on the wall creaked open, and for a split second I saw something move inside. A shadow, tall and angular, just before the panel slammed shut again. I yanked the door open and ran. The hallway was empty. I bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. My only thought was to get as far away from that apartment as possible. When I reached the lobby, I saw the police officers talking to the landlord. Relief flooded through me as I rushed toward them. "You have to help me," I said, my voice shaking. "Someone's in my apartment. They've been following me." The landlord frowned. "Josh, what are you talking about?" I opened my mouth to respond, but one of the officers cut me off. "What apartment are you in?" 3C, I said. The landlord's frown deepened. 3C. "That's been empty for years." I froze. "What?" "No, I just moved in, a week ago." The landlord shook his head. "That apartment's been boarded up since the fire. No one's lived there since." His words cut off as the officers exchanged a look. "What fire?" I demanded. The landlord hesitated. "It happened 5 years ago. Some guy lived there, kept to himself, didn't talk to anyone. One day, there was smoke pouring out of the place. By the time the fire department got in, he was gone. Just disappeared." "What was his name?" I asked, my stomach twisting. The landlord hesitated again, then finally said, "Frank. Something. Frank Miller." My blood ran cold. Miller. That was my last name. My knees went weak. Miller. My last name? Was it a coincidence? It had to be, right? "No," I said, shaking my head. That's not possible. I moved in last week. I've been staying there and packing, sleeping, everything. The landlord's expression darkened. Josh, you've got the wrong apartment. 3C is sealed. It's been vacant since the fire. One of the officers stepped forward. Sir, we'll go upstairs and take a look. Why don't you wait here? No, I said quickly. I'm coming with you. You need to see it for yourself. We climbed the stairs together, my heart pounding louder with every step. When we reached the third floor, I froze. The door to 3C was different. It wasn't the plain brown door I'd left behind. It was charred, blackened by fire, with a faint smell of smoke still clinging to it. Yellow caution tape crisscrossed the frame, brittle and faded. This can't be right, I whispered. The officer nearest to me pulled out a flashlight and shone it at the door. Sir, no one's been in here for years. It's condemned. I didn't believe him. I shoved past them, pushing the door open. It creaked loudly, the hinges stiff with rust. The air inside was thick and heavy, carrying the acrid smell of soot and decay. The apartment was nothing like I remembered. The walls were scorched, the furniture reduced to ash and twisted metal. The window I'd tried to climb out of was shattered, the glass still littering the floor. This isn't real, I muttered, stepping inside. This isn't my apartment, but it was. In the corner, half buried in debris, was the panel I'd found. It was partially open, just as I'd left it. The officer followed my gaze, frowning. What's that? I didn't answer. I walked to the panel and pushed it open. The passage was still there, just as dark and narrow as before. I told you, I said, my voice trembling, there's something in here. The officer hesitated, then motioned for his partner to follow. Stay behind us. We stepped into the passage, the beam of their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The walls felt closer than I remembered, the air colder. When we reached the end, the small room was just as I'd left it. The scratched table, the old chair, the photographs on the wall, everything was there. Except for one thing, the man in the suit was sitting in the chair. His face was shadowed, but I recognized him instantly. My breath caught in my throat as the officers froze, their flashlights fixed on him. Sir, you need to stand up, one of them said, his voice steady but tense. The man didn't move. Sir, I'm giving you one last chance, the officer warned. Still nothing. The second officer moved closer, reaching out to grab the man's shoulder. The moment he touched him, the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything. I couldn't see, couldn't hear anything except my own breathing, and then the voice came again. You shouldn't have come back, Josh. It was him, the man in the suit, but it was also me. The sound of footsteps echoed around the room, circling me closer and closer. My chest tightened as panic took over. Who are you? I shouted into the void. His voice came from behind me, cold and steady. I'm what you left behind. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The room was empty. The officers were gone. And the photographs on the wall, they were different. They all showed me. Dozens of pictures, taken at different points in my life, playing as a kid, sitting in class, walking to work. In the center was the same photograph I'd seen before, the man in the suit. Only now, his face wasn't blank, it was mine. Beneath it, written in red ink, was a single word, welcome. The screen fades to black as Josh's voice delivers the final line. Josh voiceover, some places don't just remember you. They hold on to you forever. Text appears on screen. The end. Hello my dear viewers, I would like to thank you for watching the video and I wanted to say subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be very grateful and you will not miss new videos. Enjoy the video. My name's Laura Kemp and I work as a crime scene investigator in New York. I've seen it all: horrific murders, botched robberies, and more than a few cases that kept me awake at night. But nothing prepared me for what I found in room 309 of the Grand Line Hotel. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. I was just wrapping up paperwork when I got the call. A suspicious death. The voice on the other end of the line was Detective Marcus Hale, my longtime partner in these cases. "You'll want to see this one," he said, his tone grim. When I arrived at the scene, the Grand Line was crawling with officers and curious onlookers. The hotel manager, a frazzled man in a wrinkled suit, was pacing in the lobby, wringing his hands. "Third floor," Marcus said, greeting me near the elevator. "You're not gonna believe this. Room 309 was a mid-range suite, nothing fancy, just a single queen bed, a desk, and a small sitting area. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of something wrong. The victim was a man in his 40s, well-dressed in a navy suit. He was sitting in the chair by the window, his body slumped forward, hands resting limply on his knees. The strangest part, there wasn't a single mark on him. No blood, no sign of a struggle. The room itself was eerily pristine. The bed was made, the carpet was clean, and nothing appeared out of place. Except for one thing, the door. It had been locked from the inside. Not just the regular lock, both the deadbolt and the chain were engaged. It took hotel staff nearly 20 minutes to break in, and when they did, they found the victim exactly as I was seeing him now, lifeless with no clear cause of death. I crouched next to the body, careful not to touch anything. "What do we know about him?" I asked Marcus. "Name's Richard Mayfield," he said, flipping through his notepad. "Business executive from Boston. Checked in 3 nights ago. No visitors, no signs of forced entry, and according to the front desk, no one came or went from this room all day." I frowned, scanning the scene. "Windows locked from the inside," Marcus said. "And we're 3 floors up. No fire escape, no balconies. It didn't make sense. A locked room, no visible injuries, no signs of foul play. But my gut told me there was more to this than met the eye. Then something caught my attention, a faint indentation on the carpet near the desk. I moved closer, squinting in the dim light. It was circular, about the size of a coffee mug, but it didn't match anything in the room. "Marcus," I said, pointing to the spot, "what do you make of this?" He knelt beside me, his brow furrowing. "Could be nothing. Or it could be the clue that breaks this wide open." Before we could investigate further, a uniformed officer poked his head into the room. "Detectives, you'll want to see this," he said, his voice tense. "It's from the security footage." We followed him to the hotel's back office, where a grainy black and white video was paused on the screen. The timestamp showed it was from the hallway outside room 309, taken less than an hour before the body was discovered. Marcus nodded at the officer to play it. The footage showed the empty hallway, nothing unusual. But then, at exactly 6:14 p.m., the door to room 309 opened slightly. No one stepped out, no one went in. The door closed again. And then, nothing. I leaned closer to the monitor, my heart racing. "You're telling me no one entered or left the room after this?" I asked, pointing at the screen. The officer shook his head. We've reviewed all the footage from today. The only person who entered the room was Mr. Mayfield, and that was hours before he was found. Marcus crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. So, what are we saying here? The door opened on its own, and then the guy just died. Something's missing, I said, my mind spinning. Can you rewind a few minutes before that timestamp? The officer obliged, scrubbing back through the footage. At first, it was the same uneventful hallway. Then, at 6:10 p.m., something strange happened. The light above room 309 flickered. Not a quick blink, but a slow, rhythmic dimming, like the bulb was pulsing. It lasted about 30 seconds before stabilizing. What the hell was that? Marcus muttered. Electrical issue, I offered, though I didn't believe it myself. The footage continued to play, and when the clock hit 6:14, the door to room 309 creaked open again. This time, I noticed something chilling, a shadow. It was faint, barely visible, but it moved across the floor just inside the doorway. The shadow wasn't shaped like a person. It was warped, jagged, almost insect-like, and then the door shut. Pause it, I said sharply. The screen froze, the faint shadow still visible. My skin prickled as I stared at it. Marcus glanced at me. What are you thinking? I don't know, I admitted, but whatever that is, it wasn't Richard Mayfield. Back in the room, I couldn't shake the image of the shadow from my mind. The indentation on the carpet, the flickering light, the locked door, it all felt connected, but I couldn't figure out how. I examined the desk, searching for anything that might explain the strange mark. That's when I saw it, a USB drive. It was tucked under the edge of the desk, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I grabbed a pair of gloves and carefully pulled it out, holding it up to the light. What do you think's on it? Marcus asked. There's only one way to find out, I said, slipping it into a bag for evidence. But as I stood up, something else caught my attention, a faint buzzing sound. Do you hear that? I asked. Marcus tilted his head, listening. Yeah, sounds like humming. The sound grew louder, coming from the corner of the room. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the noise, the mirror. It was vibrating slightly, as if something was pressing against the other side. The buzzing grew more intense, filling the room with an almost electric hum. Laura, step back, Marcus warned, pulling his sidearm. But before either of us could move, the mirror shattered. Glass exploded outward, shards raining across the room. I shielded my face, but I caught a glimpse of something, a dark, twisting shape disappearing into the shadows. And then, just as quickly as it started, the room went silent. What the hell was that? Marcus shouted, his voice echoing in the stillness. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the fragments of glass scattered across the floor. Because etched into one of the larger pieces were 3 words, "They are here." The room was eerily quiet after the mirror shattered. The buzzing was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on my chest. Marcus stepped closer to me, his gun still drawn, his face pale. "What just happened?" he asked, his voice low. I knelt down, examining the shards of glass on the floor. The words etched into the largest piece, "They are here," were unmistakable, like they'd been scratched in with something sharp. I don't know, I admitted, but I think this goes deeper than Richard Mayfield. We bagged the glass for evidence and left the room, both of us on edge. Back at the station, I plugged the USB drive into a secure computer, my hands trembling slightly. Marcus stood behind me, his arms crossed, his expression grim. The drive contained a single file, a video. "Play it," Marcus said, leaning over my shoulder. I clicked it, and the screen filled with grainy footage. It was a recording of room 309, but from an angle that suggested it had been taken from a hidden camera. The video began with Richard Mayfield sitting at the desk, typing on his laptop. He looked normal, calm, focused, but as the minutes passed, his demeanor changed. He glanced over his shoulder, his movements sharp and paranoid. Then he got up and walked to the door, peering through the peephole before locking the deadbolt and the chain. When he returned to the desk, the light above him began to flicker. "Here we go," Marcus muttered. Mayfield froze, staring up at the light. Then he turned toward the mirror. At first, he just stared at it, his expression blank. But then his face twisted in terror. On the screen, Mayfield stumbled back, clutching his chest as he collapsed into the chair by the window. The light above him flickered one last time and then went out completely. The video ended. "That's it?" Marcus asked, his frustration evident. What the hell was he looking at? I rewound the footage, pausing on the moment Mayfield stared at the mirror. Squinting, I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint distortion in the glass. It wasn't a reflection, it was something inside the mirror. I enhanced the frame, and the shape became clearer, a dark, jagged silhouette, its eyes faintly glowing. It was watching him, I whispered. Marcus shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "That doesn't make sense. This isn't some horror movie. Laura, what are we dealing with here?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Before we could analyze further, Marcus's phone buzzed. He answered, his face tightening as he listened. When he hung up, he turned to me, his expression grim. "There's been another death. Same ammo-locked room, no visible injuries." "Where?" He hesitated. "Room 309. Same hotel. We arrived back at the Grand Line Hotel to find chaos. Officers were everywhere, and the manager looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown." "2 deaths in the same room," he muttered, pacing back and forth. "We're going to lose all our guests." "Not your biggest problem right now," Marcus said, brushing past him. Inside room 309, the scene was disturbingly similar. The new victim, a woman in her 30s, was slumped in the same chair by the window, her face frozen in fear. I scanned the room, my nerves on edge. The mirror had been replaced, but something about it felt wrong. Marcus leaned in close. "You feel that? The air's heavier," I said. "Like we're being watched." Then I noticed it, the faint buzzing sound, barely audible, coming from the mirror. "Marcus," I said, stepping closer, "something's happening." Before he could respond, the buzzing grew louder. The mirror began to vibrate, and I saw the dark shape moving inside the glass, its jagged edges shifting and twisting. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite human, it spoke, "Leave." The lights flickered violently, and a shadow erupted from the mirror, filling the room with darkness. I felt a cold, suffocating force wrap around me, and for a moment I thought it was the end. But then Marcus grabbed my arm and yanked me out of the room. We stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air as the door to room 309 slammed shut behind us. "Laura," he said, his voice shaking. "We're not coming back here." I nodded, my heart still racing. As we walked away, I couldn't help but glance back at the door, and there it was, a faint shadow in the peephole, watching us leave. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This will help me work better and faster for you. I would be grateful, so watch my other videos. Hello my dear viewers, I would like to thank you for watching the video and I wanted to say subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be very grateful and you will not miss new videos. Enjoy the video. You never expect to find something sinister in your grandmother's attic. Especially not when you're just helping clean out her house after she moves to a retirement community in Florida. But that's exactly what happened to me last October. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and until that day my life was perfectly ordinary. I was working as a high school English teacher in a small town in Massachusetts, grading papers and dealing with teenage drama. My grandmother Helen had lived in the same Victorian house for over 50 years, and it was filled with decades of memories and apparently secrets. The attic was dusty and cramped, filled with boxes of old photographs, holiday decorations, and furniture covered in yellowed sheets. The autumn sun filtered through a small round window, creating long shadows that danced across the wooden floorboards. I was going through the last corner when I found it, a polished mahogany box with intricate carvings about the size of a shoebox. At first, I thought it was just another jewelry box like the dozens of others I'd already packed away. But this one had no keyhole, no obvious way to open it. Instead, it had a series of small wooden panels that could be slid around, like one of those puzzle boxes you see in escape rooms. I've always loved puzzles, so I sat down cross-legged on the floor and started working on it. It took me almost an hour, but finally I heard a satisfying click. Inside, I found a stack of letters, all addressed to my grandmother, dating back to 1962. They were from someone named James Cooper, a name I'd never heard before. The first letter started with "My dearest Helen" and ended with "Forever yours," but it was the contents that made my blood run cold. James wrote about a plan that had worked perfectly and how no one would ever find out what they did. He mentioned something about $50,000, a fortune in 1962, and a man named Richard Baker who had disappeared without a trace. I knew I should have put the letters back. I knew I should have called my mom or asked my grandmother about them. But something compelled me to keep reading. That's when I noticed the newspaper clipping tucked between the pages. The headline read, "Local bank manager Richard Baker missing, police suspect foul play." My sweet, cookie-baking grandmother who taught Sunday school, what had she been involved in? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do with this information now? Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my grandmother. "Sarah, dear, did you find a mahogany box in the attic? The one with the sliding panels. I need you to bring it to me in Florida. Right away. Don't open it, please." I stared at my phone, my heart pounding. What would you do? Pretend you never found it? Turn it over to the police? Or drive to Florida and face your grandmother, who might not be the person you thought she was at all? I wish I could say I made the moral choice, marched straight to the police station or confronted my grandmother immediately. Instead, I did what any reasonable person would do. I panicked. I carefully repacked the letters, closed the puzzle box, and shoved it into my backpack. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept reading and rereading the letters until the words blurred together. There were 12 in total, spanning from February to December 1962. Each one painted a clearer picture of whatever scheme James and my grandmother had orchestrated. They mentioned meetups at a place called Charlie's Diner, discussions about bank records, and something about a boat on Lake Winnipesaukee. The most disturbing letter was dated October 15, 1962. James wrote, "Helen, my love, you were brilliant today. The way you handled Margaret Baker's questions at the funeral, Oscar-worthy performance, no one suspects a thing. Richard's grieving widow will get the insurance money next week, and then we'll be home free." I googled Richard Baker death 1960 to Massachusetts and fell down a rabbit hole. Richard Baker had been the manager of First National Bank in our town. He disappeared after closing time on a Friday, leaving behind his wife Margaret and their 2 young children. The case went cold after a few months. Some thought he'd embezzled money and fled to South America. Others suspected foul play. Here's the thing that really got to me. My grandmother had been a teller at that same bank. I called in sick to work the next day and started the drive to Florida. 20 hours on the road gave me plenty of time to think. Was my grandmother a murderer? A thief? Both. And who was James Cooper? I tried searching his name too, but with no luck. About halfway through Georgia, my phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello," my voice cracked. "Sarah Mitchell." The man's voice was elderly but strong. "You don't know me, but I knew your grandmother. And James Cooper. I worked at First National back in '62. My hands started shaking so badly I had to pull over. "How did you get this number?" I asked. "Helen called me," he said. "Told me you found the box. Listen carefully. You're in danger. They never found Richard's body because the line went dead. I tried calling back. Nothing. Just voicemail. That's when I noticed the black SUV that had been behind me for the last 100 miles. The driver was wearing a hat and sunglasses, despite it being nearly sunset. My grandmother's retirement community was still for hours away. But suddenly, I wasn't sure I wanted to get there at all. The thing about being followed on a highway is that you can never be completely sure. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe that black SUV really did happen to be going the same direction for 200 miles. Maybe, but when I pulled into a gas station just outside of Jacksonville and the SUV pulled in too, I knew it wasn't paranoia. I pretended to browse the snack aisle while watching the driver through the security mirror. He was tall, probably in his 60s, with silver hair peeking out from under his baseball cap. Something about him seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. He bought a coffee and returned to his vehicle without looking at me once. That's when I remembered. There was a photo in one of the letters. A group shot outside the bank, dated summer 1962. James Cooper had his arm around my grandmother, and next to them was a young man with dark hair and sharp features. The same face, just 50 years younger. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Don't go to Sunshine Palms. Helen isn't there. Meet me at the Ocean View Cafe on A1A. 1 hour? Come alone, bring the box." Sunshine Palms was my grandmother's retirement community. With shaking hands, I called them. "Hi, I'm trying to reach Helen Mitchell in Unit 247. "Oh, I'm sorry," the receptionist said. "Mrs. Mitchell checked out 3 days ago. Her daughter picked her up. My mother was in Europe. I'd just spoken to her yesterday. I had two choices, meet the mysterious texter at the cafe or call the police, but what would I tell them? That my grandmother might have been involved in a 60-year-old crime. that I found some letters suggesting she wasn't exactly who she claimed to be. That someone who might or might not be following me wanted to meet. I drove to the cafe but parked across the street, watching. It was a small beachside place, practically empty except for an elderly couple and a woman sitting alone by the window. She looked to be in her 70s, elegant in a blue dress, her silver hair perfectly styled. As I watched, she lifted her coffee cup with trembling hands. My phone buzzed again. "I see you, Sarah. I'm Margaret Baker." Yes, that Margaret Baker. Richard was my husband. I've been waiting a very long time to talk to someone about what really happened that night. Your grandmother isn't the only one with secrets. The woman in blue raised her hand and waved directly at me. I reached for the mahogany box in my backpack. The same black SUV was still idling down the street, but now I could see the driver was on the phone. Whatever truth lay behind Richard Baker's disappearance, I was about to learn it. I just hoped I wouldn't disappear too. The bell above the cafe door chimed as I walked in. Margaret Baker's eyes never left me as I approached her table, the mahogany box clutched against my chest like a shield. "You look just like her," Margaret said softly. "Helen, I mean, back in 1962. I slid into the booth across from her. Up close, I could see the years hadn't been kind to Margaret Baker. Deep lines marked her face, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "I know what you think happened," she said, stirring her coffee. "That Helen and James murdered Richard for the money. That's what everyone thought, but the truth... Oh, the truth is much stranger." She reached into her purse and pulled out a leather wallet. Inside was a police badge. "Richard Baker wasn't just a bank manager," she said. "He was an undercover FBI agent investigating a counterfeiting ring. James Cooper was his partner." My head spun. What about my grandmother? Helen was their inside source. She discovered the counterfeiting operation was being run by the bank president himself, Charles Montgomery. But something went wrong. The night Richard disappeared, he called me in a panic. Said he had proof Montgomery was planning to kill him. He was supposed to meet Helen at Charlie's diner to get final evidence, but he never made it. I pulled out the letters. Then why did James write these? About the plan working perfectly. Margaret's eyes widened. Those aren't from James. Look at the handwriting closely. Compare it to the signature. Someone was pretending to be him. She was right. The handwriting in the body of the letters was slightly different from the signatures. "Charles Montgomery wrote those letters," Margaret said. "He planted them in that box for someone to find eventually. He wanted to frame Helen and James if the truth ever came out, but here's what he didn't know." The cafe door chimed again. The man from the SUV walked in. Margaret smiled, right on time. The man removed his hat and sunglasses. He had to be in his 80s, but I recognized him from the old photo, James Cooper. "Sorry about the cloak and dagger routine," he said, sitting down next to Margaret. "But we had to make sure you weren't being followed. Charles Montgomery's son David is now the bank president. He's been watching Helen for years, afraid she'd eventually tell someone what she knew." "Where is she?" I demanded. The retirement home said. "She's safe," James assured me. "We moved her when we realized David Montgomery was closing in. But she wanted you to find that box. She knew you'd figure it out?" Margaret reached across the table and took my hand. "Richard's body was found last month. A construction crew dug it up behind the old bank building. And we finally have proof of who killed him. But we need your help, Sarah, those letters you found. They're not just letters. Your grandmother hid something inside them. Something that will prove what really happened that night. I opened the box and pulled out the letters again. In the fading sunlight coming through the cafe window, I noticed something odd about the paper. Holding the letters up to the light, I could see tiny pinpricks through certain letters. My grandmother had used a pin to create a code, dots under specific characters that, when connected, formed words. A message hidden in plain sight all these years. She was a puzzle lover too, James said, smiling. Helen knew these letters might be found someday, so she left proof that couldn't be destroyed. Working together, we decoded the message. CM darkroom behind Vault 10 PMOCT 12RB shot twice J's saw all. Charles Montgomery, Margaret whispered. The bank's darkroom, where they processed security camera film. That's where Richard was killed. James nodded grimly. JS was Janet Smith, the cleaning lady. She witnessed everything but was too scared to come forward. She left town the next day. Charles Montgomery made sure she disappeared too. But why? I asked. What was worth killing for? Margaret pulled out an old photograph. It showed Charles Montgomery standing proudly in front of the bank. Look at the date, she said. October 11th, 1962. The day before Richard was murdered. In the photo, Montgomery was wearing an expensive watch and ring. Now look at this one. She produced another photo, dated October 13th. Same pose, same smile, but different jewelry. Richard discovered Montgomery wasn't just counterfeiting money, James explained. He was replacing real diamonds and jewelry from safety deposit boxes with fakes. Millions worth. He'd been doing it for years. The counterfeiting operation was just a cover for an even bigger scheme. When Richard confronted him that night, Margaret continued, Montgomery killed him. But Janet Smith saw everything through the darkroom door's window. Your grandmother knew too. She'd seen Montgomery coming out of the vault at odd hours, noticed the discrepancies in the ledgers. But without proof, I looked at the box again. The intricate sliding panels suddenly made sense. There's more to this box, isn't there? James reached over and pressed a hidden catch I hadn't noticed. The bottom panel slid away, revealing a false bottom. Inside lay a small notebook, its pages yellow with age. Janet Smith's diary, Margaret said. She gave it to Helen before she fled. Your grandmother kept it safe all these years, waiting for the right time. And now, David Montgomery was arrested this morning, James announced. The FBI found the original jewelry in a storage unit rented under his father's name. He'd been selling off pieces slowly for years. Your grandmother's evidence was the final piece they needed. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Turn on the news, sweetheart. Love, Grandma? Breaking news, 60-year-old bank heist solved, father-son criminal enterprise exposed. Is she really safe? I asked. James smiled. Why don't you ask her yourself? The cafe door opened one last time. My grandmother walked in, looking exactly like she always did, floral dress, pearl necklace, gentle smile. But now I saw something else in her eyes, strength, determination. The look of a woman who had carried a secret for 60 years to make sure justice would finally be served. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner, Sarah, she said, hugging me tight. But some puzzles take time to solve, and you solved this one perfectly. As we sat there in that beachside cafe, my grandmother told me the full story. Not just about the crime, but about courage, patience, and the power of truth. Sometimes the biggest mysteries aren't about what we find. They're about who we discover people really are. The mahogany puzzle box sits on my desk now, a reminder that every family has its secrets, but some secrets are worth keeping until the right moment comes to let them out. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This will help me work better and faster for you. I would be grateful, so watch my other videos. Hello my dear viewers, I would like to thank you for watching the video, and I wanted to say subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be very grateful and you will not miss new videos. Enjoy the video. My name is Jason Hill, and if you're hearing this, I guess I made it out alive. Or maybe I didn't. Honestly, I'm not even sure anymore. This all started 2 weeks ago, but it feels like it's been years. Sometimes the past and present blur together in ways that make you question what's real. Anyway, I need to start at the beginning. I need someone to know what happened. It was just another Monday night, or so I thought. I'm a delivery driver, working nights to pay off some student loans. Most of my routes are boring, quiet suburban neighborhoods or downtown offices where no one even bothers to say thanks. But that night was different. I got a call from dispatch just before my shift ended. "Hey, Jason," they said. "One last delivery for the night. It's a priority package. No signature required, just drop it off." I groaned. Of course, they give me the weird ones. But overtime meant extra cash, so I took the address. It wasn't far, just a few miles out of town. The place was called Silverwood Heights. Now, I've lived in this area my whole life, but I'd never heard of Silverwood Heights. It wasn't on my GPS either. I had to use an old map I found in the glove compartment. That should have been my first clue to turn around, but I was too tired to care. The road out there was narrow and dark, surrounded by nothing but trees. No street lights, no houses, just this eerie emptiness. When I finally found the place, I almost missed it. The sign was old and half hidden by vines. Silverwood Heights wasn't a neighborhood, it was an old, run-down apartment complex. The kind of place you don't want to be after dark. The windows were boarded up, and the air smelled like mildew and rust, but there was one light on. Just one, flickering above Unit 12. I grabbed the package from the back seat. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, and heavier than I expected. No return address, just the words "deliver to Unit 12. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Just that light, flickering like it was about to give up. I thought about leaving the box on the porch and driving off, but something told me to wait. After a few seconds, the door opened just a crack. I couldn't see who was inside, but I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper. "Come in," they said. My heart sank. I didn't want to go in there, but the tone of their voice. It was off, not scared, not angry, just hollow. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The place was worse on the inside. The walls were bare, stained with watermarks and God knows what else. The air was cold, colder than it should have been. There was furniture, but it was all wrong, like someone had moved in decades ago and never left. I called out, "Hello. I have your delivery." No answer. Just silence. Then I saw it. In the middle of the living room, there was a table, and on the table was a note. Just one line, scrawled in messy handwriting. Don't look inside the box. I stared at it, feeling my pulse quicken. I told myself it was just a joke, someone messing with me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I should have left. I should have walked out and never looked back, but curiosity is a dangerous thing. I sat the box down on the table, next to the note. My hands were shaking as I reached for the lid. I wasn't going to open it just to check if it was taped shut. But before I could touch it, I heard something behind me. It was faint, but clear enough to make me freeze. Someone or something was there. I spun around, expecting to see the owner of the apartment, but there was nothing. Just the open doorway and that flickering light outside. That's when the box fell, not tipped over, fell like someone had pushed it. It hit the floor with a thud and the lid popped open. I couldn't stop myself. I looked. The box hit the floor with a heavy thud and the lid slid open just enough for me to see inside. At first, I thought it was empty. But then I noticed something small, barely visible. At the bottom, it was wrapped in a dark cloth. My stomach churned. Whatever was in there. It wasn't right. I hesitated. The note's warning, "Don't look inside the box," was screaming in my head. But curiosity has a way of digging its claws into you, doesn't it? Slowly, I reached down and peeled back the cloth. That's when I saw it. It was an old photograph. Black and white, faded around the edges. At first, I couldn't make out what it was. A house, maybe. No, not a house. A room, empty, except for a chair. And sitting in that chair was me. I froze. The photo was grainy, but it was unmistakable. The same jacket, same jeans, even the scar on my left hand. It was me sitting in a chair, staring at the camera with this blank expression. But here's the thing, I'd never been in that room before. Never seen it in my life. I wanted to believe it was some kind of trick, a doppelganger, maybe. But as I stared at the photo, a memory surfaced. A dream, or something that felt like a dream. I remembered sitting in that chair, staring at the camera. I remembered someone or something standing behind the lens. I slammed the lid back on the box and stood up. My legs were shaking. I didn't know what to do. My instinct was to leave, to run out of that apartment and never come back, but as I turned toward the door, I saw it. Another note. This one was taped to the inside of the door. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. The handwriting was the same as the first note, messy and rushed. It said, "You've been chosen. Do not leave." I felt trapped. My mind was racing, trying to piece it all together. Chosen for what? Who left the notes, and why me? I grabbed the box and headed for the door anyway. Screw the warnings, I wasn't sticking around to find out what they meant. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, something changed. The flickering light above the door was gone. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the walls were closing in. And then I heard it, a sound that made my skin crawl. It was coming from the far end of the hall. Steady, deliberate, getting closer. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew I wasn't alone. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear myself think. I backed up toward the stairs, clutching the box like it was a lifeline. That's when I saw them. Two figures, standing in the shadows. Their outlines were just barely visible, but their eyes, those I could see clearly, pale, glowing, and locked right on me. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping over myself. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. But the second I hit the parking lot, I realized something was wrong. My car was gone, the lot was empty. I spun around, trying to make sense of it. That's when I saw the building, or rather, where the building had been. Silverwood Heights was gone. In its place was nothing but an empty field, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken concrete. It was like it had never been there. The box was still in my hands. I thought about throwing it into the field, leaving it behind. But before I could, I heard something, a voice. Quiet at first, then louder. It wasn't coming from inside the box. It was coming from me. I dropped the box and ran. I didn't stop running until I made it back to my apartment. But even now, I can still hear that voice, and I can feel them watching me. For 2 days, I stayed locked in my apartment. I didn't go to work, didn't answer my phone. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those glowing eyes in the hallway, staring at me like they were waiting for something. And that voice, "Do not leave," it kept playing over and over in my head like a song I couldn't shut off. I thought I was losing my mind. I threw out the clothes I'd worn that night. Burned the map I used to find Silverwood Heights. Anything to erase the memory, but the box, I couldn't get rid of it. I left it outside my apartment door, hoping someone would take it. But every time I checked, it was still there, like it was waiting for me to bring it back inside. The morning of the 3rd day, there was a knock at my door. Not the mailman, not my landlord. It was soft, deliberate. Like whoever was on the other side knew I was there but wasn't in any rush. I froze, my heart pounding. Then the knocking stopped, and I heard the faint rustle of paper sliding under the door. I waited a few minutes before I opened the door. No one was there, but there was a note. Same handwriting as before. Messy and uneven. It said, "You still have time. Bring the box back." Underneath was an address I didn't recognize. Someplace called Ravenwood Grove, 3 towns over. I wanted to ignore it, to throw the note in the trash and pretend it didn't exist. But something about that name, Ravenwood Grove, it got under my skin. I didn't know how, but it felt familiar. Like I'd heard it before, though I couldn't remember where. By the time the sun set, I was already on the road. I told myself it was just to get answers, to end whatever this was once and for all, but deep down I knew the truth. I wasn't in control anymore. Whatever was happening, it was pulling me along like a puppet on a string. The drive to Ravenwood Grove took 2 hours. Most of it was on empty highways, surrounded by trees and farmland. The kind of drive that makes you feel like the world's just a little too big. When I finally found the place, it was almost midnight. Ravenwood Grove wasn't a town or even a neighborhood. It was a single house sitting at the end of a dirt road. The house was old, but not abandoned. The windows glowed faintly, like there were lights on inside. A cold breeze cut through the air, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and decaying leaves. I grabbed the box from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. When I saw the box with my name written on it, I felt the world tilt. My own handwriting, how was that even possible? My first instinct was to run, but where would I go? It was like every road led me right back to this moment. I had no choice but to open it. Sound effect, faint echo as Jason slowly opens the box. Jason narration. Inside, I found a photograph and a key. The photograph was black and white, just like before, but this time it was clearer. It showed me standing outside my childhood home at 19 Ashwood Lane. In the background, someone or something was watching from the window. My hands started to shake as I picked up the key. It was old, rusted, and ice-cold. But the moment I touched it, everything fell into place. Sound effect, faint whispers growing louder, morphing into a rush of air. Jason narration. Memories flooded back, ones I didn't even know I had. I remembered sitting in a chair, staring at a camera. The darkness surrounding me, the whispers telling me what to do. And then, a voice, my own voice, but colder, commanding me to deliver the box. That's when I realized this wasn't the first time I'd been here. Sound effect, Jason's breath quickens, faint heartbeat thumping. Jason narration. The memories weren't from dreams. They were real. I had delivered a box before. Years ago, to someone else. I didn't know why or how, but I knew one thing for certain: whatever this was, it was a cycle. One that I was now trapped in. Sound effect, low hum, faint wind blowing through the room. Jason narration. I had to finish it. I had to take the box to the address written on the tag, 19 Ashwood Lane, my childhood home. The place where it all began. Sound effect, Jason's footsteps echoing, music building in intensity. Crime Story script, Episode 1, Part 5 revised. Intro music begins, quiet and foreboding. Jason narration. I pulled up to 19 Ashwood Lane just after sunset. The house looked the same as I remembered, small, with peeling paint and broken shutters. But something about it felt off, like it was alive and waiting for me. The key in my hand felt heavier with each step I took toward the door. Sound effect, gravel crunching underfoot, faint wind rustling leaves. Jason narration. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the memories hit me like a tidal wave. This was where it started. Years ago, I'd found the same box on this very doorstep. I'd opened it, found the key, and followed its instructions to deliver it to someone else. It had been passed to me, just like I was passing it on now. The house was part of it, too, a piece of the puzzle. Sound effect, door creaking shut. Jason's breathing grows unsteady. Jason narration. The air inside was thick, suffocating. The walls seemed to hum, almost like they were alive, and then I heard it, the voice. My voice, coming from the darkness at the end of the hallway. Jason's voice, cold and distorted. You've come full circle. Sound effect, faint whispers, growing louder. Jason narration. I followed the sound, even though every part of me screamed to turn back. The hallway led to a single room, the same room I'd seen in the photographs. The chair was there, sitting under a single light bulb that flickered weakly. On the chair was another box, identical to the one I'd been carrying. And standing behind it was me. Sound effect, sudden rush of air, music crescendos. Jason narration. The figure looked just like me, but its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. It smiled, cold and unfeeling. You understand now, don't you? It said, this is your purpose. To carry the box, to pass it on, just like I did. Jason narration. My knees went weak as the truth slammed into me. This wasn't just a coincidence or a random nightmare. It was a cycle, one that had been going on for years, maybe decades. Each person who received the box became the next in line, delivering it to the next target. And now it was my turn to pass it on. Sound effect, faint ticking of a clock, echoing footsteps. Jason narration, the figure handed me the new box, and as soon as I touched it, the room disappeared. I was standing outside again, under the glow of the street lights, holding the box. But this time, there was a new name written on it, a new address, a new target. Sound effect, Jason's heartbeat, slow and deliberate. Jason narration, I don't remember how I got back to my car. I don't even remember driving home, but now, as I sit here writing this, I know what I have to do. I have to deliver the box to you. Dramatic sound sting, fading to silence, text on screen, the cycle continues. What would you do if the box was delivered to you? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more chilling stories. Outro music fades in, haunting and unresolved. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This will help me work better and faster for you. I would be grateful, so watch my other videos. Hello my dear viewers, I would like to thank you for watching the video, and I wanted to say subscribe to my YouTube channel. I will be very grateful and you will not miss new videos. Enjoy the video. My name's Jack Sullivan, and I never thought my life would take the turn it did when my wife, Emma, and I moved to Sycamore Lane. It was a quaint street in a sleepy New England town, a place where every house looked like it belonged on a postcard. It was exactly what we wanted, peaceful, quiet, and the perfect spot to start fresh after the chaos of city life. We'd found a house at a bargain, which, looking back, should have been a red flag. It was a 2-story colonial with peeling white paint, a wraparound porch, and an old oak tree in the front yard that seemed to groan every time the wind touched it. The kind of house that came with character or baggage, depending on how you looked at it. The first few days were uneventful, aside from the usual unpacking chaos. Emma was ecstatic, already talking about repainting the kitchen and planting flowers in the front garden. I was happy to see her excited. It had been a tough year for us, and we both needed this fresh start. But something about the house unsettled me from the moment we stepped inside. It wasn't anything obvious, no creaky floors or flickering lights, no eerie cold spots or phantom footsteps. Just a feeling like the walls were watching me, like the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't say anything to Emma at first. It sounded ridiculous, even to me. We bought the house fair and square, and there was no reason for me to feel this way. Then, on the third night, things started getting strange. I just settled into bed with a book while Emma scrolled through her phone beside me. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of crickets outside. I was halfway through a chapter when I heard it, a soft creak. I looked up from my book. The sound had come from downstairs. Did you hear that? I asked, turning to Emma. Hear what? She didn't even glance up. Sounded like someone on the stairs. She raised an eyebrow. It's an old house, Jack. Old houses make noise. She was probably right, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I set the book down and climbed out of bed. Where are you going? She asked. Just checking something, I muttered. I grabbed the baseball bat I'd left by the door, habit from our city days, and headed down the hallway. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, each step amplifying the silence around me. The living room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Everything was as we'd left it, boxes half unpacked, furniture covered in dust sheets. But then I saw it, the front door. It was wide open. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the room, gripping the bat tightly. There was no sign of forced entry, no shattered glass or broken locks. Just the door swinging gently on its hinges like it had been opened by the wind, except the air outside was still. I stepped forward, my eyes darting to every shadow in the room. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I'd intended. No answer. I closed the door and locked it, checking the bolt twice for good measure. I even checked the windows to make sure they were secure. Then I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. That's when I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. In the dusty wooden floorboards near the door, there were footprints. Bare footprints leading from the door to the middle of the room and then stopping. No prints leading out. No sign of where the person had gone. They just ended. I turned around slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But there was no one there, just shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I didn't sleep that night, and the next morning I didn't tell Emma about the footprints. Not yet. Something told me this was just the beginning. The morning after I found the footprints, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, or maybe my own imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew better. Emma was already downstairs, humming softly as she made coffee. She looked so carefree, so happy. I didn't want to ruin that with my paranoia, so I plastered on a smile and pretended everything was fine. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The footprints, the open door. The way the air in the house felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. As I sipped my coffee, I decided to take a closer look around the house. Maybe I'd missed something last night, some logical explanation that would put my mind at ease. "Hey," I said casually, "I'm going to check out the basement today. See if there's anything down there we need to clean up." Emma wrinkled her nose. "The basement? Good luck. I peeked down there yesterday. It's a disaster. Probably full of spiders." I laughed, trying to keep things light. "Spiders I can handle." The truth was, I wasn't worried about spiders. I was worried about what or who might have been in the house last night. The basement door was at the back of the house, near the kitchen. It creaked loudly as I opened it, revealing a set of rickety wooden stairs that led into darkness. I flicked the light switch on the wall, and a single bulb buzzed to life, casting dim yellow light over the space below. The basement was exactly what you'd expect in an old house like this: low ceilings, exposed beams, and concrete floors stained with decades of neglect. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew. I started looking around, checking for anything unusual. At first, it was just the typical junk: old boxes, rusted tools, a broken chair. But then I noticed something strange in the far corner of the room. A door. It was small, almost child-sized, and made of warped wood. The paint was peeling, and the edges were framed by cobwebs. It didn't look like it had been opened in years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crouched down to inspect it. There was no handle, just a keyhole, but I didn't have a key. I pressed my ear against the door, half expecting to hear something on the other side. And that's when I heard it, a faint whisper. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. It was so soft I could have convinced myself I'd imagined it, except I knew I hadn't. I was about to call out to Emma when something caught my eye. Scrawled on the wall beside the door in faded red letters was a single word: leave. My stomach twisted into a knot. The letters looked decades old, but why would someone write that, and why here? Before I could think too much about it, I heard Emma's voice calling from upstairs. "Jack, you okay down there?" I forced myself to sound calm. "Yeah, just a lot of junk. I'll be up in a minute." I stood there for a moment, staring at the door. The whisper, the writing, the feeling of being watched, it was too much to ignore. I needed answers. That night, after Emma went to bed, I stayed up researching the house. I didn't want to alarm her until I knew what we were dealing with. It didn't take long to find something. The house had a history, a long, dark history. Back in the 1950s, it had belonged to a man named Robert Gaines. He was a recluse, rarely seen by his neighbors, but they all knew about the strange things that happened in his house: lights flickering, strange noises, even reports of people seeing shadows moving in the windows when no one was home. Then, one day, Robert disappeared. No one knew what happened to him, but the rumors started almost immediately. Some said he'd gone mad and fled. Others believed he'd been murdered. But the most chilling theory was the one that kept me staring at my screen long after midnight. They said he wasn't alone in the house. They said something had been living with him, something he couldn't escape. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. The next morning, I told Emma we needed to leave. She laughed it off at first, thinking I was joking. But when she saw the look in my eyes, her smile faded. "Jack, what's going on? Why are you acting so weird?" I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane, so I told her about the open door, the footprints, the warning in the basement. Her expression shifted from confusion to concern, but not in the way I'd expected. "Jack," she said quietly, "you locked the door last night." "I saw you do it." "I know," I said. "But when I came downstairs, it was open." She shook her head. "No, it wasn't. I came down before you did." The door was closed. My blood ran cold. If the door hadn't been open, then where had the footprints come from? Emma's words haunted me for the rest of the day. If she'd seen the door closed, then I had no explanation for what I'd seen the night before: the footprints, the door swinging open, the faint whisper. And the worst part, I could tell Emma didn't fully believe me. She didn't say it outright, but I could see it in her face. She thought I was overreacting. But I knew what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the bedroom door, listening for any sound, any sign that something was wrong. Emma was sound asleep beside me, her soft breathing the only thing keeping me grounded. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again. The whisper. It wasn't coming from the hallway this time. It was closer. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and strained to listen. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a soft, rhythmic murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I nudged Emma awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She groaned, half asleep. "Hear what?" "Listen." She sat up reluctantly, rubbing her eyes. For a moment, the room was silent, and I thought maybe the noise had stopped. But then it came again, just loud enough for both of us to hear. Emma froze. "Jack, is that—" "I don't know," I said, cutting her off. The sound was coming from downstairs. I grabbed the baseball bat and motioned for Emma to stay put. "Lock the door behind me," I whispered. "Jack, don't just do it." She hesitated, but when I stepped into the hallway, I heard the soft click of the lock behind me. The house was pitch dark, the kind of darkness that made every shadow feel alive. I moved slowly, gripping the bat so hard my knuckles ached. The whispering grew louder as I descended the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. It was coming from the living room. I rounded the corner, and there it was again, that same eerie whisper, faint but insistent. It didn't sound like one voice, though. It sounded like several, overlapping and tangled, like a crowd murmuring all at once. I scanned the room, but it was empty. The windows were closed, the front door locked. Nothing was out of place, except the basement door. It was open. The whispering grew louder as I approached it, and I could feel the air around me grow colder with every step. I flicked on the light, illuminating the rickety wooden stairs. The sound was coming from below, echoing up from the darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to wake Emma and leave the house for good. But something stronger, a mix of curiosity and stubbornness, kept me moving forward. I descended the stairs, the bat held tightly in my hands. The basement looked the same as it had that morning, dim, damp, cluttered with junk. But the sound was louder now, almost deafening. It was coming from the small door in the corner. I approached it slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The door was still as I'd left it, worn, cobwebbed, with that single word scrawled beside it. Leave. I crouched down, my breath fogging in the cold air, and placed my hand on the door. The whispering stopped. The silence was worse. My entire body tensed as I leaned in, trying to hear anything, movement, breathing, anything. And then, from the other side of the door, I heard a voice. Clear as day. Jack. I stumbled back, the bat clattering to the floor. My name. It had said my name. I bolted up the stairs and slammed the basement door shut, locking it for good measure. My hands were trembling as I stood there, trying to catch my breath. Emma was at the top of the stairs, her face pale. Jack, what happened? There's something down there, I said, my voice shaking. Something not human. She stared at me. Why died, but before she could respond, we both heard it. The doorbell. We froze, staring at each other. It was nearly 3 a.m. Who would be at our door in the middle of the night? I grabbed the bat again and moved cautiously toward the front door. Emma closed behind me. I peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. Then, as I turned away, the knocking started. Loud, deliberate, and coming from the basement door. The knocking from the basement door echoed through the house, each thud making my heart slam harder in my chest. Emma clung to my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Jack, she whispered, her voice trembling. What's going on? I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, torn between fear and disbelief. Something was down there, something that knew my name, and now it wanted in. Go upstairs, I said, my voice barely steady. What? No, I'm not leaving you. Emma, please. I turned to her, gripping her shoulders. Lock yourself in the bedroom. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the basement door. Jack, what if? Just go, I said firmly. She nodded reluctantly and hurried up the stairs. I waited until I heard the bedroom door lock before turning back to face the basement. The knocking had stopped for a moment. The silence was so complete it felt suffocating. I stared at the door, bat in hand, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I tightened my grip on the bat, every muscle in my body tensing. The knob twisted back and forth, rattling like someone was trying to force it open. But the lock held. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. No answer. The rattling stopped, replaced by a faint scratching sound like nails dragging across wood. And then I heard it again. "Jack." The voice was low and guttural this time, almost a growl. It wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was behind me. I spun around, swinging the bat wildly, but the room was empty. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I scanned every shadow, every corner. That's when I heard the sound of breaking glass. It came from upstairs. "Emma." I bolted up the stairs at a time, the bat clutched tightly in my hands. The hallway was dark, but I could see shards of glass glinting in the moonlight from the bedroom window. "Emma," I shouted, throwing open the door. She was standing by the bed, pale and trembling, pointing at the broken window. "Jack, someone's outside." I crossed the room and looked out. The backyard was still, bathed in silvery light. But then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. They were tall and thin, their face hidden in shadow. For a moment they just stood there, motionless, staring up at the window. And then they turned and disappeared into the trees. I felt Emma's hand on my arm, pulling me back. "We need to call the police," she said. She was right. I grabbed my phone and dialed, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm, as I explained what had happened: the knocking, the voice, the figure in the yard. She assured me an officer would be there within minutes and told me to stay put. But as I hung up, I realized something. The house was too quiet. "Emma," I said slowly, "did you lock the basement door?" She looked at me, confused. "I thought you did." My blood ran cold. The silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps coming up the basement stairs. We backed away as the footsteps reached the door. The handle rattled once, twice, and then the door burst open, but there was no one there. Just the dark, yawning mouth of the basement and the sound of breathing, deep, ragged breathing coming from the shadows. The sound of breathing filled the air, low and guttural, coming from the blackness of the basement. Emma clung to my arm, her nails digging into my skin as we stared at the open doorway. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "Stay behind me?" I tightened my grip on the bat and stepped forward, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The air spilling from the basement was icy, heavy with a damp, earthy smell that made my stomach churn. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing down the stairs. The breathing stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then, slowly, a shape began to emerge from the shadows. At first it was just a vague outline, barely distinguishable from the darkness. But as it stepped into the dim light of the hallway, I saw it clearly, and I wished I hadn't. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His skin was pale and waxy, stretched tightly over sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes. He wore tattered clothes, stained with something dark and unidentifiable. But the most horrifying part was his mouth. It was twisted into an unnatural grin, his teeth yellow and jagged, and his eyes, they were black. Completely black, like twin voids that seemed to pull you in and swallow you whole. Emma let out a strangled gasp, and the thing tilted its head toward her, that grotesque grin widening. "Jack," it said, its voice a guttural rasp that made my skin crawl. It took a step toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. I swung the bat with everything I had, but it passed right through the thing as if it wasn't even there. It didn't flinch, didn't react, just kept moving closer. "Emma, run!" I shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the front door. We sprinted outside, the cold night air stinging my lungs. I didn't stop until we were standing in the middle of the street, gasping for breath. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent. For a moment, I thought maybe we'd escaped, then I saw it. The figure was standing in the front window, watching us, and it wasn't alone. Behind it, more shapes began to appear, their hollow eyes and twisted grins glowing faintly in the darkness. I grabbed Emma's hand. "We have to go, now." We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, where the flashing lights of a police car finally came into view. The officer who arrived, a gruff, no-nonsense type named Officer Harlow, listened to our story with a skeptical frown. He agreed to check the house, but told us to stay back. We watched from the safety of his patrol car as he disappeared inside. For several minutes, there was nothing but silence. Then, suddenly, his voice crackled over the radio. "This is Harlow. I'm going to need backup. There's something down here." Static. The next thing we heard was a blood-curdling scream, followed by a deafening crash. The radio went dead. Emma and I stared at each other, paralyzed with fear. Minutes later, more police cars arrived, their sirens piercing the night. Officers stormed the house, but when they came out, they looked pale and shaken. They wouldn't tell us what they'd found. The next morning, the house was boarded up, and we were told not to return. The official story was that Officer Harlow had fallen and injured himself in the basement. No mention of the voices, no mention of the figure in the window. But Emma and I knew the truth. We moved out of town the next day, leaving everything behind. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. And when I close my eyes, I see those black, hollow eyes staring back at me. I don't know what we unleashed in that house, but I know one thing for certain. It's still there, waiting. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. This will help me work better and faster for you. I would be grateful, so watch my other videos.